Determine all critical numbers for the function f of x equals 4x to the 1/3 minus x to the 4/3. Critical numbers are the x values that make the numerator and the denominator of the derivative equal to 0 and are in the domain of the function. The first thing to do is find the domain. F of x equals 4x to the 1/3 minus x to the 4/3. Each of the terms has a fractional exponent. The denominator of the fractions are the root. Both of them are odd, and an odd root has a domain that is all reals. Therefore, the domain of the function is all real numbers, or negative infinity to positive infinity. The next thing to do is find the derivative. F prime of x equals, the first term is power rule. We'll bring down the power, multiply it with the 4. Subtract 1 from it. I will call it 3/3. The second term is power rule. Bring down the power, multiply it with the negative 1. Subtract 1 from it. I will call it 3/3. The first term, 4 times 1/3, is 4/3. X raised to the 1 minus 3 negative 2/3 power minus 4/3, and then x to the 4 minus 3 1/3 power. We can now factor a 4/3 out, which will leave x to the minus 2/3 minus x to the 1/3. We can now factor out a power of x. We always factor out the lower of the powers. There is a positive 1/3 and a negative 2/3. The negative 2/3 is the lower power. When we factor, we're dividing, and dividing means subtraction of exponents. So when we factor out an x to the negative 2/3, we're subtracting a negative 2/3, which is adding a 2/3 to each of the powers inside. The first power, a negative 2/3, if we add 2/3 to that, that'll become x to the 0, which is just a 1. So that'll leave a 1 behind. That's not a surprise because it was x to the negative 2/3, and we just factored out x to the negative 2/3, which leaves a 1. For the second term, x to the positive 1/3, we will be subtracting a negative 2/3, adding a 2/3 to it. 1/3 plus 2/3 is 3/3, which is x to the first power. We have a negative power. It will move to the denominator. There's a 4 in the numerator. There's a 1 minus x that will stay in the numerator since it's not to a negative power. There's a 3 in the denominator, and then the x to the negative 2/3 can move to the denominator to become x to the positive 2/3. We can now set the numerator equal to 0 and the denominator equal to 0. The numerator, 4 times 1 minus x equals 0. We can divide both sides by 4, so 1 minus x equals 0. Subtract 1 from both sides, so minus x equals negative 1. And divide both sides by a negative 1, so x equals 1. For the denominator, 3x to the 2/3 equals 0. We can divide both sides by 3, so x to the 2/3 equals 0. And now we can raise both sides to the reciprocal, so 3/2 power. Because 2/3 times 3/2 is 6/6, or 1, and that will turn the left side into x to the first power. On the right side, 0 raised to any power is 0. Now we look to see if these are in the domain. The domain was all real numbers. So x equals 1 is a real number, and therefore we keep it. X equals 0 is a real number, and therefore we keep it. And there are the two critical numbers for the function, x equals 1 and x equals 0.